If your shots are feeling flat and boring and you want to make them look more interesting, this episode's for you.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Hi, and welcome to DIY Film with Merle Becker, the channel where I help you make better videos. As always, stick around to the end of the video for today's bonus filmmaking tip. So there's a saying that goes something like, life is how you frame it. And I like this saying because it implies that things aren't inherently good or bad. It's saying that you have control to make things better. The good or bad in life all depends on how you frame it. So if something bad happens to you, you can frame it in your mind as an opportunity to grow stronger and learn from your mistakes. And suddenly the bad thing becomes kind of a good thing. So this principle is kind of the same thing when it comes to filmmaking. Often you can make an otherwise ugly shot interesting simply by framing it differently. It all has to do with where you place your subject, what else is in the frame and where it is, what you leave in the frame and what you leave out, how balanced your image is or isn't. All of these things can help you frame your shot in an interesting way. And the fact is, you can make a pile of garbage look interesting if you just know how to frame it right. So when you pick up your camera, you shouldn't just be pointing it at your subject and hitting record. You should be thinking, how can I frame this to make it more interesting? Now, there's a whole other video I'm going to do about choosing the right framing to support your narrative, but for now, we're just going to focus on using framing to create interesting shots. Also, I should mention the things that I'm going to talk about in this video can apply to both still photography and video. Okay, so here's my list of 4 things you can do to make your shots more interesting. Number 1, pay attention to the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is probably the first and most important framing rule every filmmaker learns about in film school. It's so important, in fact, that many cameras have a built-in overlay to help you compose your shots using the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds works like this. First, divide your frame into 3 parts, both vertically and horizontally. If you're shooting landscapes, put the horizon on either the upper or the lower third. And if you're shooting a subject, put them where the lines intersect. For some reason, these 4 intersection points are always points of interest in a widescreen frame. The viewer's attention is always drawn to them and away from the empty space. And when you place your subject at an intersection point, face them towards the empty 2/3 of the frame. Filmmakers have followed the rule of thirds for decades, and they continue to follow it today, literally all the time. In fact, the next time you're watching a Hollywood movie or a TV show, pay attention to how many shots are framed with the subject placed at a rule of thirds intersection point. You'll be amazed at how almost every shot follows this rule. So follow the rule of thirds, and you'll end up with an instantly more appealing, cinematic, and above all, interesting shot. Number 2, add depth. Adding depth to your shot is another easy way to add interest. Adding depth means making it look more like there is a distinct background, subject, and foreground in the shot. It's kind of like you're giving the shot layers. There are a few ways to add depth. The most common way is to separate your subject from the background by making the background blurry and making your subject in crisp focus. One way to do this is to move your subject far away from the background when filming him or her. Then use a low f-stop on your camera so there's a shallow depth of field. The subject will be in focus while the background will be blurry. Another way to add depth is to place objects in the foreground of your shot. Or you can film from behind or in between something. Or you can reveal your subject from behind an object. And you can also film your subject through an object. And if 2 characters are having a conversation, you should position them so that when one is speaking to the other, you also see a little bit of the other character in the foreground. Any way that you can think of to create layers or depth in your video will make it more interesting. So ditch your flat compositions and focus on creating some depth for more interesting shots. Number 3, use leading lines. So by now you probably caught on to the fact that you're always trying to draw your viewer's attention to your subject. Each of these techniques encourages that. And the leading lines rule is no exception. Leading lines are simply natural lines that appear in your frame that point to your subject. By having lines in the frame that lead to the subject, the viewer's attention is drawn to them. So what can serve as a leading line? Leading lines can be something like a fence, or a bridge, or a tree. Or it can be actual lines on a road. Or leading lines can also be some well-placed lights. So try placing your subject at the intersection of lines to draw the viewer's attention to them. In most cases, the leading lines will give your shot that extra kick it needs to make it interesting. And lastly, number 4, use symmetry. The symmetry rule is the one time when you can ignore the rule of thirds, because if you're creating symmetry, you're dividing your frame into 2 equal parts. Symmetry means having similar elements on each side of the frame. Humans love symmetry and order. It helps us make sense of things. We're inherently uncomfortable when we see chaos, and we're at peace when we see order. It's just how we tick. And subconsciously, we love to see order and symmetry in video. So filmmakers take advantage of this. They use symmetry all the time. Symmetry can be found in shots that have equal parts on top and bottom, or left and right, or with a pattern, or on a grid. There's just something about a symmetrical shot that's inherently satisfying. So use symmetry the next time you're framing your shot and give your audience what they want. All right, so let's do a quick recap. 4 things that you can do today to make your shots more interesting are: use the rule of thirds, add depth, use leading lines, use symmetry. All right, let's go to the tip. When I'm shooting B-roll, I'll usually try to frame the same shot in a few different ways. Then I pick my favorite in the edit. The reason for this is that sometimes, or quite often, stuff looks better in the viewfinder than it does in the edit, and vice versa. And sometimes I might love how I framed a shot at the time, but it doesn't work that well in the context of the whole piece. Put simply, when I see the other shots around it, it no longer works well for me. So I always try to give myself several options, and you should too. Because quite often, your favorite shot in the field becomes the bane of your existence if that's all you've got. Okay, hopefully I've framed this discussion about framing in a way that's useful to you. And as always, if you found any of this helpful, please give the video a thumbs up, subscribe and hit the bell so you know when the next one is up, and I will catch you next time.